In 2014, Bianca and John O'Brien were newlyweds living in the trendy inner West Sydney suburb of Rozelle. With the iconic city of Sydney at their front door, the couple in their early 30s, only just 11 months prior, had welcomed a baby boy into the world, a baby boy that they would name Jude. The story you're about to hear is really about the decisions we make. Choices. Everybody has a choice. And it's those choices, those decisions we make, that can sometimes see us spending the rest of our lives in jail.
Just can't get my head around how anybody could be that selfish.
The police reviewed something like 1,000 hours of footage. That's a lot of painstaking work to identify what's happened.
This is the last time I saw this little boy.
The floor started to sink through like a sinkhole.
Did she die quickly?
See that there was a message on my phone and had a look and it said, I love you.
The psychopaths divide the world into two types of people, the predators and the victims.
Bianca and John O'Brien were living their best lives. John worked as an electrical engineer while Bianca stayed home looking after their newborn baby. The young family lived in a rented apartment above a phone shop on Darling Street. Darling Street is what Americans would call a strip mall. So the busy street is lined with different businesses and restaurants and things of that nature. Behind these buildings is usually a laneway, with maybe a little bit of parking, but primarily it's the main access point to the second stories of these buildings. And in most cases, above the ground floor shops are rented apartments. And this was the situation for the O'Briens. They had a narrow staircase that led up to a small balcony that they used to access their flat. The couple had a downstairs toilet, and if the phone shop was open, they could walk through the shop to avoid the walk by the laneway. Over time, of course, the couple got to know the shop owner quite well, and they would exchange pleasantries and small talk. Next door to them was a convenience store called Rozelle Convenience. The owner had opened the business at the start of the year. And above Rozelle Convenience was another apartment. The apartment was occupied by three single men in their late 20s and early 30s. Their names were Todd Fisher, Corey Cameron, and Christopher Nobles. The three men had a similar setup to the O'Briens, with a rear staircase and balcony to access their unit. This area really is inhabited largely by a demographic of under 40s, professional, usually with no children. And when the couple start having kids, it usually pushes them out of the area when they are looking to buy a property due to the exorbitant property prices. So for the occupants of these two apartments, even though they were at different stages of life, with the O'Briens having just started a family and the three single young men next door, everybody got along. Life was pretty good. But that would all come to an end in the early hours of September 4th, 2014. In a statement John O'Brien would give to the police, he would tell them that he and his wife Bianca had been up most of the night. The third was a Wednesday, so it was the middle of the working week. Their baby Jude had been battling a cold for the past few days. It was just after 3 a.m. and baby Jude had finally fallen asleep. John figures, instead of trying to go back to sleep and only getting just a few hours, I'll go into work early, finish early, and then catch up on sleep tonight. His wife Bianca agrees. She thinks it's a good idea. But before John is set to leave, his wife Bianca needed to use the downstairs toilet. So as John is getting ready for work, Bianca headed off to the downstairs bathroom. He tells police that when she came back, it was 3:15 a.m. She was complaining about a strong smell of what she thought were paint fumes coming from the convenience store next door. And given the fact that he had only opened the shop 9 months earlier, prior to the opening, he had renovated the place, so they figure maybe he's remodeling. But at the same time, they are both tired. Bianca wants to try and get some sleep, and John wants to get the day out of the way. So they don't give it a second thought. She goes off to bed and John leaves for work. As close to the city Rozelle is, not even a 10-minute drive, the street is dead quiet. The drive to work for John is peaceful. It's up at a time when it feels like the whole world is asleep. But for John, and unbeknown to him, his plans for his family's future and the celebrations of his son's first birthday, a huge milestone for any parent, would be shattered in less than an hour. From the couple's sleepy apartment, only 1 kilometre up the road, is the Balmain fire station. For the firefighters working, they refer to this shift as the graveyard shift, as it's usually pretty quiet. Some of them scroll social media while others watch movies and talk amongst themselves. The night had been fairly uneventful. That was until a few minutes after 4 a.m. A loud explosion echoes up the street. The explosion is so loud, it feels like the foundations of the building shake. The firefighters immediately stop what they are doing and stare blankly at each other. Car sirens are going off and dogs are barking. They instinctively know that whatever that was, it was bad. Really bad. The eerie silence is only broken when one of them musters the words, "What was that?" But before anybody could answer, the fire station siren starts sounding and the roller doors shoot up. A job has been allocated to them by an emergency dispatcher. The firefighters grab their fireproof jackets and start climbing into the cabs of the trucks. The truck engines fire up. They are loud and noisy, the distinctive thump of a diesel engine. But they fail to block out the sounds of the chaos outside. They can already smell the smoke cutting through the dark, cool air, like a warm knife through butter. The job wasn't far, less than a 1-minute drive. As they tear out of the driveway, several residents had exited their homes and were standing on the street looking around for the source of the loud bang. With sirens blaring, they round the turn onto Darling Street. Usually they can see all the way to the end of it, to the main street, Victoria Road, which ferries people out of the city and into the suburbs of Greater Sydney. But on this night, the view was blocked by thick black and grey smoke hurtling up the street and dissipating into the atmosphere. As the trucks draw nearer to the source of the explosion, their vision is cut down to near zero. One firefighter would later tell reporters that once they laid eyes on the blaze, it looked like a scene out of a Hollywood movie. The entire lower floor of Rozelle Convenience and the phone shop was engulfed in flames. The apartments on top were starting to collapse on themselves. As the truck tyres screeched to a stop, a crowd of onlookers had gathered, wide-eyed, hands covering mouths, shocked as they watched the horrific scenes unfold. The firefighters quickly began working on the blaze. The heat was so intense that it seemed like the water spraying out of the hoses was evaporating before it could reach the flames. All the emergency responders could do is hope that everyone had made it out in time. A group of first responders decided to head around the back of the building via the laneway. They figured if anybody had made it out alive, that's where they'd be. Carrying all their gear, they quickly moved down Darling Street, turning left onto Nelson, which wasn't very far anyway. Crowds of local residents were flocking to the scene, most having been woken up from their sleep by the initial blast. The power to the entire area had been severed after the explosion. It was pitch black, except for the glow of the fire. The scene was silent, except for the roar of the fire and the cackling of the wood burning, and the mini explosions as part of the building creakily collapsed. In the distance, faint yells from the first responders could be heard, as they were yelling for this bit of gear or that bit of gear, but they were mostly drowned out by the raging fire. As the emergency workers rounded the laneway corner, 2 wounded men approached them in a panic. One of the man's hands was profusely bleeding and upon closer inspection had sustained a degloving injury where the tendons and muscles on the finger stripped from the bone, exposing it. His palm had a large laceration on it. The other man was limping and blood from his foot was staining the pavement. Blood drops from both men led back up the laneway and to the backside of the burning building. The 2 men were Corey Cameron and Todd Fisher, John and Bianca O'Brien's neighbours. Paramedics wanted to take the men to treatment, but they refused to leave. One of the men would tell them that their friend and roommate, Christopher Nobles, hadn't made it out in time. As he said this, one of the firefighters noticed something moving in the background. It looked like a human hand sticking out of some debris at the foot of the building, slowly waving as if to signal for help. Corey Cameron and Todd Fisher's stories to the police described what had happened in those harrowing minutes just after 4 a.m. After the loud explosion heard by the fire department had initially gone off, the trio's apartment started filling with thick black smoke. The three men, having been woken up from their sleep, started banging on the walls of each other's bedrooms, screaming to evacuate the flat. At this point, everyone was awake and had yelled back. In the hallway, they fought to breathe, relying on muscle memory to make it to the exit at the rear of the flat as their eyes burned from the smoke. Corey and Todd smashed through the glass rear doors, cutting themselves in the process. Disorientated and with parts of the building already falling around them, they leapt from the second-story balcony railing and onto the ground below. It was at this point the pair realised that Chris wasn't with them. They tried to clamber back up the staircase, but were pushed back by the overwhelming heat of the fire. As the firefighter was looking at the hand sticking out of the debris, he signalled the other rescuers that they may have a survivor. If you were anything like me, I love being first to things. When a new album drops, I listen to the whole thing and I pick out songs I think will get future radio play and will become big hits. I'm like that with TV shows too. Of course, I tell my friends, you got to listen to this song or you got to watch this on Netflix. A lot of the times they don't even bother. And 6 months later, they have the nerve to come to me telling me about this stuff. And I'm like, dude, I told you about it 6 months ago. Well, I like to think this channel's going to do something. My proposition to you is, if you like the story so far, consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a comment what number subscriber you are. I remember when Mr. Ballin only had a couple of 100,000 followers. I keep telling people I was early before he became huge, but nobody believes me. Now, let's get back to the story. With paramedics attending the two men's injuries, the firefighters cautiously started moving towards the rear of the building. At this stage, the apartment above continued collapsing. Small fires were burning all around the building from the strewn debris. In their minds, they couldn't help but wonder, is this Chris? Did he beat the odds and actually make it out of the apartment? Battling the heat, they lifted off a large refrigerator that had trapped the person and with their bare hands started digging the rest of him out. Each rescuer knew that the longer they stayed this close to the building, the more dangerous it would get, so they had to be quick. As the man was lifted out, he kept repeating, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do it, over and over again. As the rescuers whisked him off the safety, what they saw was a heavily set middle-aged man of East Asian appearance. One of the firefighters asked him, "Are you Chris?" To which he responded, "No, my name is Adeel Khan. I own the convenience store." Adeel would be loaded into the back of an ambulance and attended to by paramedics. Again, he was profusely apologising. His injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. Adeel had sustained a fractured pelvis and lacerations to his forehead and face. He would be taken to Royal Prince Alfred Hospital with the two other survivors. Firefighters would battle the blaze for several more hours before bringing it under control. Local television news crews were on the scene, broadcasting the devastation to a waking Australian public. John O'Brien, upon hearing the news, would race back to the scene. Bianca hadn't been picking up her phone. In his mind, you can only imagine what he must have been thinking. Maybe she left the phone in the apartment and that's why she didn't answer his calls. On the scene, he would beeline to attending police officers. He would tell them his wife and baby were unaccounted for. Rescuers now knew they had 3 missing people. The search for the missing people was a dangerous one, and hopes of finding anyone alive in the collapsed rubble that had taken out several buildings at this point was minimal. At 10:15 p.m. that night, 27-year-old Christopher Noble's body would be discovered under a collapsed metal roof in the southwest corner of the building. Given that his bedroom was located at the front of the building, directly above Adil Khan's shop, his window was covered in steel bars. The bars were put there to prevent people climbing on top of the roofed awning and breaking into the apartment. But unfortunately, investigators discovered that the doorframe above his bedroom door buckled due to the intense heat of the fire, entombing the young man inside. Eyewitnesses on Darling Street would later tell the police that they could hear his terrified shouts of sheer panic from inside the burning building. In his final moments, knowing that he was surely going to die, Chris only had one thought in mind: to send a final text message to his mother Liz, which read, "I love you." A later autopsy revealed that Christopher Noble died from smoke inhalation. John O'Brien would tell detectives about his wife's downstairs bathroom visit at 3 a.m. and the paint fumes wafting out of Adil Khan's convenience store. The detectives had already spoken to other first responders who had told them of a strong gasoline smell in and around the building. They had also told the detectives about the suspicious things Mr. Adil Khan had said when he was rescued. With the discovery of Chris's body and investigators now suspecting the fire was intentionally lit, police believe they may in fact have a homicide. Although at this stage, the cause of the fire hadn't been proven, this information certainly shone an unfavourable light on Mr. Adil Khan. So the detectives would interview him from his intensive care bed at Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. With the body of one man found and a missing mother and child still to be located, police knew that they may in fact be talking to a multiple murderer. There was no room for error. All checks and balances needed to be kept. They searched Adil's belongings and the clothes he was wearing. Straight away, the overwhelming smell of gasoline was noted. Also in his possession was a plastic cover that detectives would later find out belonged to the electrical fuse box on the side of the building. During the interview, Adil denied any wrongdoing and claimed he was the victim of a robbery gone wrong. He claimed 3 masked men held him hostage from 11 p.m, just before he was about to shut his shop. The 3 men had tied him up and doused the entire shop floor with petrol, including all around his feet. He would tell police officers he was terrified. He said the 3 men demanded money from him that he did not have, and he would go on to say that after beating him, the men left just after 4 a.m. and he was able to make his escape.
The nitrates in that barrel go off, the whole building will blow.
He claimed that when he opened the rear door through the storeroom to make his escape, the fuel must have spontaneously combusted. He explained his apologies to the first responders was for them putting their lives in danger to save him. As unlikely of a story this was, detectives had to pursue all leads. They scoured local CCTV footage from surrounding businesses, and sure enough, just before the explosion, a silver car can be seen leaving the area. The footage was dark and grainy, and a license plate could not be made out, so detectives used the local media, plastering the vehicle all over the news in hopes the driver or anyone with information would come forward. On the 5th of September at 11:30 a.m, the bodies of Bianca O'Brien and 11-month-old baby Jude were discovered. Bianca had in fact made it out of bed and into her baby's room, where together they spent their final moments. This officially meant that detectives had 3 dead bodies resulting from this tragedy. Investigators wanted to know everything about Adil Khan. His story of being a victim of robbery, although plausible, was flimsy at best, so they started doing a bit of digging into his background. Adil Ahmed Khan would immigrate to Australia in 1996 and later would become an Australian citizen. Originally from Pakistan, Adil was smart, really smart. Already having completed a degree in mathematics in his home country, he would later complete a double degree in IT and teaching from the Universities of New South Wales and the University of Technology, Sydney. Adeel had a strong work ethic and motivation to succeed, and with that success in mind, relocated him and his family to the United States in 2009, where he applied his newly acquired IT skills in the family's retail business. Although the move would be short-lived, with the Khan family moving back to Australia in 2012, he would register a company with the intentions of developing modules for businesses to aid in day-to-day operations. Although this business venture would never come into fruition, in December of 2013, he would sign a 5-year lease on a former 7-Eleven convenience store at number 629 Darling Street, Rozelle. Adeel would rebrand the vacant 7-Eleven store to Rozelle Convenience and spend several months refurbishing the shop before opening its doors to the public. While detectives were diving into the background of Adeel Khan and doing follow-up interviews, on-scene forensic experts had come to the unanimous opinion that the fire was ignited from the rear storeroom. The investigation took almost 2 weeks, with the finding being that fuel vapours had built up to a high level due to gasoline being spread throughout the entire shop. On-scene investigators would discover as many as 12 small plastic containers scattered around the remains of the convenience shop's floor. Some of the containers had combustible material like paper and cardboard surrounding it. Torn fabric soaked in fuel linked each container together with a single petrol-soaked piece of fabric leading out through the storeroom to the back of the shop, almost like a wick. They had concluded that around 30 litres of fuel had been used, and upon ignition, a fireball rocketed out of the back of the shop where Adeel Khan had been standing. A lighter would be discovered at the rear of the property, where Adeel was found trapped under the large refrigerator, which had come hurtling out of the rear door after the explosion. Upon investigation, police concluded that the electrical box had been switched off at 2:47 a.m, and detectives had already found the plastic piece from the fuse box in Adeel's possessions at the hospital. Adeel's car was found with the keys in the ignition, and in the boot of his car, plastic containers containing more fuel. This prompted investigators to start asking members of the public for more information on Adeel's movements in the days prior to the deadly fire. Detectives would discover that Adeel's dreams of being a successful shop owner started to crumble as his customers were few and far between. He was in direct competition with several larger supermarket chains, one being an IGA just a few doors up from him. In April of 2014, with the mounting debts from his business loan, supplier creditors, rent and electricity expenses, he attempted to sell the business, unsuccessfully. By September of that year, he was in financial strife, with a $3,435 electricity bill marked overdue, and he was owing tens of thousands of dollars in back rental payments to the landlord. Adeel, being the head of the household and the main financial provider for his family, decided to withdraw $50,000 from the business to meet out his debts. But this was a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Adeel was stuck in a 5-year lease on a failing business, with an ongoing obligation to pay a monthly rent of $8,800. He had a mortgaged home and a young family to support. The stress of failing himself and his family was becoming unbearable. He would stay up late at night going over his leasing agreement, looking for any clause that could aid him in terminating the lease early without the financial obligation of paying out the entirety of the 5 years. As he meticulously studied the commercial leasing contract, he came across a potential way out, a way out that would not only null and void the contract, but enable him to pursue an insurance claim of $225,000. In his mind, that would wipe all of his debts clean and he would have a fresh start. But it was risky, it was dangerous, but to him, fortune favours the brave. With the word already out on the street, investigating officers started being contacted by members of the general public. In the days prior, on September 1st, Police were tipped off that Adil had purchased 38.82 litres of fuel from a Croydon Park service station near where he lived. CCTV footage showed him filling up 4 large plastic containers located in the boot of his car. Customers of his convenience store came forward and described the inside of his shop on the day of the explosion as stifling hot, as if he had intentionally been heating it up. Forensic testing had come back on his clothing and had shown that it did, in fact, have the remnants of fuel soaked into it. Police would look into his financial records and discover that he was hemorrhaging money and in a dire financial situation. They reviewed his commercial leasing agreement with the landlord and discovered a fire clause. If the shop or building were to burn down, he would be free of his obligations on his 5-year leasing agreement, and he would also collect on a hefty insurance policy. With the evidence stacked up against him, Adil Ahmed Khan would be arrested and charged on the 23rd of September with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of recklessly causing injury, 1 count of recklessly wounding, and 1 count of deliberately setting a fire for financial gain. He would be remanded into custody until trial. His trial wouldn't take place for almost 2 years. On the 9th of May 2016, he would enter a plea of not guilty to all 6 counts. During the trial, he showed no remorse and continued to claim his innocence, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. His excuse for the 38 litres of fuel that he purchased was viewed as laughable, as he claimed he was testing his car with different types of fuel to see if he could make it more economically viable. The jury didn't buy it. On the 10th of June 2016, the jury found Adil Ahmed Khan guilty of the murder of Christopher Noble. They would also find him guilty of the counts of recklessly causing injury to Todd Fisher and the wounding of Corey Cameron. Adil would be found guilty of intentionally causing a fire for financial gain. However, the jury needed more time with the 2 counts of murder for Bianca and Jude O'Brien. Just 4 days later, on the 14th, the jury had made a unanimous decision: not guilty on the 2 counts of murder for Bianca and Jude O'Brien, but guilty of manslaughter. The reason for the finding was that Bianca and Jude lived in an apartment above the shop next door. When Adil had intentionally set his own shop on fire, he knew full well that the occupants directly above would be in direct danger, hence the murder charge for the death of Christopher Noble. The Australian public were understandably not happy with the outcome for Bianca and baby Jude. In the lead up to the sentencing, a counselling psychologist was tendered to assess Adil Ahmed Khan. The psychologist found he had no indication of any behavioural issues, no history of any diagnosis or interventions for issues either psychiatric or psychological. There was nothing in his early development or his social or family life that might have offered any insight into why he did what he did, and why he still refuses to take responsibility for it. He was still deemed a low risk of reoffending. On August 5th, 2016, Adil Ahmed Khan would be sentenced to 40 years in prison with a 30-year minimum. His incarceration would be backdated to his arrest on the 23rd of September 2014, so he will be eligible for parole on the 22nd of September 2044.